in every position that I've taken, I've been the first person in that one. So that's always a blessing and a curse at times. I had the privilege of helping to create the Women's Health Center at UCLA. That was new, and we had to explain what women's health was and a whole view of women's health beyond the reproductive system. We've kind of felt like we were pioneers in some ways and just following the science. When I was at Humana, I took the position because it was a unique position. No one had never been a vice president of women's health. There was no roadmap.
When I started inspiring women, I had one clear mission to advance the next generation of women leaders. This show is for you. Whether you're climbing the corporate ladder, building your own business, or navigating the complex world of healthcare leadership. That's why I'm asking you to please take a few minutes and fill out our quick 5-question survey. Your feedback will help shape the future of this show, what topics we cover, which guests we feature, and how we can best support your leadership goals. Visit inspiringwomen.show/survey to share your thoughts. That's inspiringwomen.show/survey. Your voice matters, and I can't wait to hear from you. Now, let's dive in. This is Inspiring Women. I'm Laurie McGraw, and I am speaking to Dr. Mitzi Krockover. And Dr. Mitzi Krockover is an incredible number of things. Some of those things is she is a physician. She is the founder and CEO of Women Centered. She is the host of Beyond the Paper Gown podcast. She is a commentator. She is an investor, and she has been a leadership voice for advancing women into leadership. Mitzi, I'm so excited to have you on Inspiring Women. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it is my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
As we were just talking, I've worked at the American Medical Association for many years. I've worked with physicians for many years.
Yes.
It's hard to be a physician. It's harder to be a physician today. So, Dr. Mitzi, let's talk about multi-sectored leadership. You have been a leader at companies like Humana. You are a leader in terms of investing. You help women at many different stages of their careers. So as you lead women's health initiatives, and that's a area that is under a lot of pressure as well as a lot of opportunity. So how do each of the different sort of areas that you've been in a leadership role in the area of women's health, how has that changed over time? And what are you thinking about the women's health sector today?
Oh, wow. Um, that's a really interesting question. And it's interesting and difficult because I've had in every position that I've taken, I've been the first person in that one. So that's always a blessing and a curse at times. And also, they're obviously very different positions and different sectors. And so, if you look at academia, I think it's certainly much more challenging now because honestly, the political headwinds that are happening, especially as it pertains to women, we can talk a little bit more about that. So I think that navigating that right now, even though, when I had the privilege of helping to create the Women's Health Center at UCLA, that was new, and we had to kind of explain what women's health was, and especially as internist, and a whole view of women's health beyond the reproductive system and all of that. But we've kind of felt like we were pioneers in some ways and just following the science. And now again, there's just so many other challenges beyond just that, right? When I was at Humana, I took the position because it was a unique position. No one had never been a vice president of women's health. And I got to really immerse myself in a corporate environment and focusing again on women's health, which again didn't necessarily go hand in hand. And we had some interesting opportunities there as a healthcare company. But again, given the opportunity, it was a terrific one to be able to do that. But again, there was no roadmap. So, sometimes bumpy. And now, I got into investing actually through my interest in women's health because I saw these women who were creating solutions for healthcare issues because there were no solutions either in the marketplace or the healthcare system. And so I found myself being introduced to the folks at Golden Seeds, which is an angel investment organization that focuses on women led companies. And the reason why they were so before their time when they were started over 20 years ago was because, and it hasn't moved the needle. I should say that the needle hasn't moved that much in terms of numbers
Right.
because women were not getting funded, especially at those early stages. But groups like, Golden Seeds have really helped that. So that was a thesis that I could get behind and learned a lot about in terms of women um, creating their own companies or leading companies, but also having to fund companies and being able to navigate that. And then when you add on the layer of women's health, having to sell women's health products or services or diagnostics to usually a room of men who may not understand that right away. And so, I guess you can see some common threads that everything is a challenge and everything's an opportunity. But when you add on the layer of women's health, it makes it a little bit more complicated.
So when you've done these different roles in women's health and sort of like being the first, okay, so the first and to break into the categories. I mean, from my perspective and from many people, I would say in the world of health and care, we think about women's health as, oh yes, like of course, an obvious, an important place to focus. A lot of people think about it as only reproductive health, women having babies and things of that nature. Maybe let's just like go back a little bit because for the past probably 5 years, maybe a year and a half ago, we were having quite the heyday with women's health. A lot of investment, exciting companies coming forward, and as you mentioned, we're sort of in a really rough road right at the moment. So maybe talk about the progress that was made with women's health and where we are right now, and then I want to talk about some of the opportunities that you're seeing from that investment lens.
Sure. And you made a real good point. So let's also level set, if you will. So when I talk about women's health, I'm talking about women's health in a very expansive way. It are those conditions that may manifest differently in women, such as heart disease. Both men and women experience, unfortunately, heart disease, and it's the number one killer for both of us. But symptoms are different and physiology may be somewhat different. We don't know enough to know, right? Because of the
Hmm.
research that still needs to be done. Those conditions that are predominantly in women, 66% of people with Alzheimer's are women, 80% of people with osteoporosis are women, and a majority of people with certain autoimmune diseases are women. So there's something going on there, right? That as well. And then that third bucket, reproductive health and gynecologic health as well. And it's breast cancer, we'd also include that. 90 plus percent of people with breast cancer are women. So when I think of women's health, I think of, you know, anything and everything that touches women. And we have to ask the question, how does sex make that different? I've told every dean of medical schools that, I've talked to, my fantasy is not that you have a women's health module. My fantasy is that every student comes away or comes to their professor or their teacher saying, how is this different in women? And if the answer is, I don't know, well then, hey, you've, realized a gap. And that's what we call in investment community, a white space, right? So that's women's health. Getting back to your question, I'm trying to remember what your question is because I went off a little bit.
Well, just the state of change, because again, the past couple of years, I would just say has we saw a lot of new investment, and surprisingly, women's health was significantly underinvested in. We also know that the exciting innovations, drug discovery, all of those types of things. We know that clinical trials. It wasn't until just a few decades ago that it was required that women were part of clinical trials for drugs and medications, important therapies. And that, I mean, it seems remarkable that that is true. That is in our very recent history. So there was a lot of spotlight on that, a lot of investment into new exciting companies, again, which I want to talk to you about in the investment space. But then now things started to change a little bit. So maybe like, where are we going?
Sure.
What's happening right now?
You're right, and you're very astute. In 1993 was the NIH Revitalization Act that mandated that if you were the NIH was going to fund your research, was where most research was being funded, or a significant amount. You had to include underrepresented groups, including women and certain other populations. And we can talk about again. I think people are maybe somewhat aware that it wasn't necessarily that people wanted to exclude women. It's just that women are complicated. We have all these variables called hormones, as well as we have babies, and you don't want to hurt babies, right? Or unborn babies. So it was a little paternalistic. But obviously, then we didn't have information. And just because we're the same species doesn't mean our components with the XY chromosome have the similar kinds of experiences or physiology that we do. And so that was a watershed moment. And it wasn't until 2016 that the NIH said that you had to even consider sex as a variable. And we're not talking about gender, we're talking about sex, the chromosome pieces. And what we know, for example, is that females have very different inflammatory responses that may, again, impact on some of those other things that we just talked about before. We have, there's just very much, again, um, uh, very, we're not just little men, as many
Yep.
people have said. So given that, so when I started the Women's Health Center, that was, again, something that we were very aware of, but we didn't have a lot of information, and we did the best at what we could. A really good example of um, a research situation was the Women's Health Initiative, where we were prescribing hormones for menopause, and then the Women's Health Initiative came about, said that, well, it might increase breast cancer, it might increase heart disease. So we stopped because, like, God forbid, we didn't want to hurt anybody. And I always say the headlines were about how what the bad stuff was, what the Women's Health Initiative was, but there were no headlines when they reanalyzed the data to show that, hey, what we were looking at was was an older cohort. And if you look at the data differently, actually there are a number of women who would benefit from hormone therapy if you prescribe it in a way. But a lot of doctors didn't get the message, and certainly a lot of patients didn't. So again, examples of why it's so important to be current and for people to focus on the science. And then, again, so we were getting a good trajectory. More, there were 8, I believe, centers of excellence like UCLA in terms of women's health centers. That was, again, given by the Department of Health and Human Services. A lot of good things were happening, but things didn't really, from in my perception, I think I should say, a lot of progress was being made. However, we really saw a real bloom, if you will, probably prior to the pandemic, but certainly the
Hmm.
pandemic as well, because of the increase. I think it's a perfect storm. First of all, you had more women in leadership in all areas: science, clinicians, policymakers, entrepreneurs, even increasingly so venture. Right? Then you had increase in technology, and so that's helpful. And then also, again, just an increase in this research and information. And as you said, up until about, I don't know how many months ago, we were seeing a lot of impetus, not only for women's health research, increasing funding, but increasing innovation dollars, and also starting to see investment. And honestly, you can't close that door, no matter how much you might want to. And I don't, and there's some glimmers that say that not even Congress wants to be honest with you. But unfortunately, there was some things were done with an axe and not a scalpel. And so
Right.
anything with women or, gender or sex just got, didn't make it through the algorithm. And so we're seeing a decrease in funding there. But I will say that, again, that train left the station a few years ago. And so what I'm seeing is that increasingly investors want to invest in women's health. There are growing funds that are just focused on women's health. We know the largest transfer of wealth is going to be to women of
It's
this age.
coming.
So, you know, it's really hard to ignore 51% of the population. And the other piece of it that's good for everybody is that there are studies such as the Women's Health Access Matters study that showed if you increase the small amount of investment that we have in research funding in women's health in certain areas, we can get an ROI of $14 billion with a B.
I know
And
there's so much
McKinsey showed $1 trillion,
opportunity.
right?
Yep.
And so one thing I'm involved with that I don't know that um, you may be aware of, we've actually here in Arizona really, put a flag in the sand that says that women's health innovation, we are that ecosystem for women's health innovation because we see the economic advantage of doing that, both to our economy and also when you improve women's health, duh, it improves the health of the community.
Well, there's so much behind that, but I do want to talk a bit more about that. But before we do, Missy, I actually want to talk a little bit more about you as a physician, as somebody who invested, your career on, the days of making women's health, household words and something that didn't exist before your leadership in so many different areas across women's health in terms of the center, in terms of the as a physician, in terms of being a leader at Humana. And then you moved to investing. And then you decided that it was important to not just do the work as a physician leader, but also to turn your leadership into investing in innovation and helping other companies. So, first of all, why that change? Why was that an important change for you to make when you were at the top of your game, in terms of pushing the boundaries of advancing women's health?
Wow, that's very kind. I don't really see it that way. I've kind of been very blessed by having opportunities that have led me to other opportunities. And so, I had incredible colleagues who are still doing incredible work at UCLA. The center is still thriving under the leadership of Dr. Janet Pregler. And, we had that cohort of a group that was just energized by the opportunities that we were given to create another model of care. And then when Humana, that opportunity came about, it kind of seemed like, wow, that's an interesting opportunity. I can go from working with patients 101 to working with members by the millions and potentially, making a difference there. And knew that, healthcare companies like Humana were not just gatekeepers and there were some opportunities. And I like to think that, I was a part of that. And then, like I said, yeah, you heard how I got into innovation because again, seemed like the way now to make a difference that I could make a difference in what I'm doing. And it also goes for advocacy as well. I'm a very active member of Women's Health Advocates that is basically working to advocate for those policies that will increase funding in women's health research, that will increase workplace policies, as well as those innovation grants that have been given that de-risk companies for better investment opportunities and especially women's health. So it's just one kind of thing leads to another. And when I look at young people and I talk with them, because I think that a lot of career counseling at colleges especially is very traditional. I just, especially now, I think that this generation kind of gets it. You don't know what's going to be available to you, what positions are going to be available to you 5 years from now. So you can't really plan for the long term other than to take opportunities as they feel right to you, and that again builds on your skills that you have at that time.
Well, you've leaned into it. And so maybe it's actually so interesting to me for somebody with the expertise that you have in the space of women's health. You actually sound quite optimistic. You're talking about the train has left the station in terms of the research that's underway and the obstacles that are currently here, whether it's funding or taking an axe on certain programs versus perhaps a more measured approach. You don't sound deterred to me. So I just, that's encouraging in many ways. But where does that optimism come from? Do you, are we are seeing a blip? Do you see do you expect much more progress to come? Research, funding, results? What's your point of view?
Maybe I'm Pollyanna, but I don't think so. Uh, there are so many problems, and there are so, and if you think about where we were and, the hurdles now that we have to, you know, uh, go over that we may not have had to go over, a couple of years ago, it can get kind of disheartening. But I just look around with the people, mostly women, but men too, who are in this space in all those areas that I talked about. And uh, I just don't see anybody letting up. And again, and I do think, again, when you talk to people one on one, especially those that hold the purse strings, if you can make a good point and a solid point with data, and you can bring it down to their own constituents, their own communities. I mean, I joke when I, give a talk. I said, "How many of you know a woman?" It's, um, I think that, and we can kind of get rid of some of the things that are kind of lightning rods, because those are important too. But there's so much that we can talk about that I don't think anybody can disagree that we shouldn't have women with worse outcomes than men when it comes to having heart disease, or that we have women who are the caretakers of most of everybody.
Most
Um,
everybody.
Right. And, who are the caretakers of people with Alzheimer's? Women. So if they have Alzheimer's, you're losing your workforce. And then if you look at the menopause study that showed that women with severe menopausal symptoms leave the workforce, causing economic challenges for those workplaces, as well as increased healthcare costs, which impacts all of us. If you, what we don't do very well in general is connect the dots. And so I think that has been for me kind of my, reason for being, in terms of I'm always trying to connect the dots and saying, one thing leads to another. None of this is done in isolation. So going back to why am I um, excited, because so much work has been done. We have a great foundation. We have great people, especially women in leadership in all these areas. And I just think that they're not going to go back to their corners. I think they're just going to keep going in any way they can. And if I can, I think because of that wealth transfer, women are seeing themselves not only as benefactors or philanthropists. What I really want them to see is themselves as investors, because they can make impact in a way, just as they can write that check to the American Heart Association, which is so important and needed and necessary. They can also write a check for in an impact in a different way. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive, to help a young entrepreneur who's got a great idea for something that needs, support. And, again, assuming all the boxes are checked and it makes sense, and I think that women sometimes are, like I was, intimidated by investment. And so I know that we at Golden Seeds have, Knowledge Institute, other organizations do. It's not brain surgery. It's complicated, yes, and it's a different language, but there's lots of people. And if you don't want to do the due diligence, you can join a fund, and see and watch your money be deployed in different ways, and see the impact of that.
Well, Missy, that just like hearing your passion behind this and your optimism, I just have to say is so incredibly encouraging and infectious. So I really appreciate it. As we close out on this inspiring women conversation, I would love it if you just, if you just reflect on your own professional career where you've had so much impact already, and there's no signs of stopping in terms of, where you intend to have further impact. What advice would you give to younger generations of women who are pursuing, whether it's women's health or something a bit sort of like obscure in the now, in terms of just, a life of impact is how I'm hearing you in everything that you've been pursuing and are doing?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today and for your great questions and for all the work you've done. I mean, you certainly have had a great deal of impact as well as bringing, women like myself to have an opportunity to share. I think the lesson that I've learned in my relatively senior age is just, kind of going with the flow and really being able to say yes to things, even if you don't feel comfortable. If somebody asks you to do something, you probably have most of the skills that are needed. We tend to, as women, want to dot our I's and cross our T's and then raise our hands. Raise your hand first and you'll figure out how to dot those I's, you know, and you can learn, you can learn on the job or whatever it is. But if it's something that is interesting in that, again, someone has seen that you can probably give impact, you can. And I just think that we don't always, if it's not challenging you and it's not scaring you a little, then it's probably not worth doing.
Yep, that is so true. This has been such a great, inspiring women conversation. I've been speaking with Dr. Mitzi Krockover, and Dr. Mitzi, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.